He thought he'd shut the world out forever, until a starving horse collapsed at his gate and forced him to open his heart again. He had spent months hiding from a life that had broken him. But at dawn, as the desert wind carried a thin cry across the empty land, he looked up to see a starving horse stumbling toward his gate, then collapsing at his feet. In that fragile moment, a man who wanted nothing to do with the world was forced to choose: walk away or save the one creature who still believed in him. The sun had not yet climbed over the ridge when Ethan Ward stepped out onto the porch of the old ranch house, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as the early heat pressed against his skin. Arizona had been in a long drought that felt biblical. Weeks of skies like hammered metal, months without a single decent rain. The land around him was cracked into plates, each one lifting slightly at the edges like a giant puzzle no one alive could solve. His boots scuffed through dust so fine it rose in slow pink clouds around his ankles. He didn't mind the silence. In truth, he depended on it. It was the only thing that didn't judge him, didn't remind him of what he used to be before the bottom fell out, before the betrayal that hollowed him out from the inside. The ranch wasn't much, just a forgotten patch of earth he'd bought after his life in the city burned down around him, figuratively, although the financial collapse had felt just as consuming as a real fire. He had once guided people through retirement planning and financial recovery, talking about security and long-term stability with the confidence of someone who believed he knew how life worked. Now, he kept his own papers stuffed in a drawer and prayed the roof wouldn't collapse in the next dust storm. The irony wasn't lost on him. He reached the old gate out of habit more than intention. The gate was a relic of better years, cedar splintered by sun, hinges rusted to the color of dried blood. Ethan kicked a clump of dirt off the bottom rail, watching it crumble in slow motion. A cool wind slipped through the boards and brushed his face, but it died as quickly as it came, leaving behind the same heavy stillness he'd become used to. The quiet usually soothed him. But that morning, something disturbed it. From the far end of the dirt road, a faint shape materialized, shimmering like a mirage. Ethan narrowed his eyes, unsure if it was just heat bending light the way it liked to play tricks at dawn. But the shape moved. Slowly, unevenly. A creature pulling itself forward on legs that looked too thin to hold anything at all. His breath caught without warning. It was a horse. As it drew closer, Ethan felt his pulse thrum against his ribs. The animal's ribs stood out like the staves of an old barrel, sharp beneath a dull brown coat dusted in red earth. Its mane was tangled with burrs, and its struggle, sent a twist of something unpleasant through his chest. He told himself it was pity, but it felt like recognition. The horse stopped several yards from the gate, its head dipping low as if the weight of the world hung from its neck. A dry, raw sound escaped its throat. Half sigh, half plea. Ethan's fingers curled around the top of the gate, knuckles whitening. He wasn't sure how long he stood like that, caught between impulse and reluctance. He had gotten used to keeping his distance from anything that needed him. Distance meant safety. Distance meant survival. The horse swayed. Once. Twice. Its eyes lifted, finding his through the dust. They were not wild, not angry. They were simply tired. So desperately tired that Ethan felt something in him shift, as though the ground beneath his boots had tilted a fraction. He didn't want to care. He had promised himself he wouldn't care again. Caring had cost him too much. caring had left him with nothing but an empty ranch and a head full of nights he didn't want to relive. But the horse took one more step, a trembling, brittle step, as if asking permission for something it didn't have the strength to demand. Then its legs folded underneath it. The sound wasn't dramatic. It was soft, like a large sack being set down gently. But to Ethan, it cracked through the quiet morning like a gunshot. Dust billowed around the fallen body, rising slowly as if the earth itself exhaled. Ethan didn't move at first. He felt rooted to the spot, his throat tight. The fall had been too final, too deliberate, as if the animal had come this far just to collapse at his feet. Ethan swallowed hard. "Damn it," he whispered, barely audible to himself. The horse lay perfectly still, except for the faint, labored lifting of its ribs. Ethan stepped closer, hesitated, stepped back. He felt foolish, afraid of approaching an animal that clearly couldn't hurt him in this state. But it wasn't the horse he was afraid of. It was everything it represented. Need, trust, responsibility. Words he had learned to hide from. A breeze kicked up again, carrying the smell of hot earth and something else. Something metallic and faintly sour. Pain. Neglect. Ethan's stomach turned. He crouched down near the gate, his hand hovering inches from the latch. One movement, one small gesture, and he would be letting something into his world again. Something that might depend on him. Something that might break in his hands. Something that might leave. His breath shuddered without permission. The horse let out another thin exhale, its eyelids fluttering but not opening all the way. Ethan didn't know much about horses despite living on a ranch. He'd bought the land for solitude, not livestock. The only equipment he knew how to use was old ranch equipment he'd learned to maintain through trial and error and more than a few YouTube tutorials. But he didn't need experience to recognize desperation when it stared him down. He exhaled slowly and placed both hands on the gate. The metal was hot, even at this hour, and it stung his palms. The sting grounded him, anchored him, reminded him that he was still here, still breathing, still capable of choosing something other than silence. Inside his chest, something whispered, "Open it." But he didn't. Not yet. He knelt there, caught in the thin border between what his life had become and what it might become if he did one simple thing. He watched the horse breathe, watched its flank twitch weakly, watched its chest rise and fall like a tide losing strength. The mountains in the distance glowed faintly, the sun finally cresting the horizon. Ethan drew in a shaky breath. The gate creaked under his weight as he finally, slowly, pulled the latch. And that was the moment everything began to change, though he wouldn't understand that for a long time. The moment the metal clicked free, the horse's ear twitched, just barely, as if it had been waiting for that sound. Ethan stepped through the opening, dust swirling around his boots, and the world felt suddenly, terrifyingly open. The world seemed strangely quiet the moment Ethan stepped through the open gate, as if even the wind held its breath. Dust drifted around his boots in slow spirals, softening the harshness of the morning. The horse lay just a few feet ahead, its sides rising and falling in shallow, uncertain waves. Ethan felt the weight of each breath the animal took, as if the effort of staying alive echoed inside his own chest. He crouched slowly, not wanting to startle it, though the creature was far too weak to react. "Easy," he murmured, the word barely more than a sigh. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself or the horse. He reached out a hand, hesitated, then let his fingers graze the air above the animal's cheek without making contact. The heat radiating off its body felt unnatural, like a fever left to burn for too long. Its coat was coarse with dirt, but he could see a faint shimmer beneath. Evidence of a time when this horse had once been cared for. His fingers finally touched its skin. The horse didn't flinch. Instead, its eyelid lifted just enough for him to see a sliver of dark, tired eye beneath. Something in that look, soft, resigned, painfully gentle, sent a ripple through Ethan's spine. He had seen eyes like that before. In the mirror. On the worst days, when he tried to piece himself back together after betrayal had torn through his life like a wildfire. Days when he'd searched online for mental health support, but couldn't bring himself to click any of the links. The horse breathed out, a warm gust against his wrist. "You're still fighting," he whispered. "Guess that makes two of us." He stood up and looked around the empty yard. The ranch house leaned slightly to one side, as if it, too, had grown weary of standing alone. The old water trough sat a few yards away, half filled with murky rainwater from months ago. Ethan jogged toward it, his breath quickening with urgency, and dumped the old water before refilling it from the spigot connected to the only functional pipe on the property. It sputtered and coughed before finally streaming out in a steady flow. When he returned to the horse, he knelt and cupped his hands, letting water pool between his palms. It spilled over his fingers as he lifted it toward the animal's muzzle. The horse didn't move at first. Then, slowly, it extended its nose and touched the water, lapping weakly. Each slow sip felt like a victory. Fragile, quiet, but real. Ethan made several trips, his hands reddened by the cold water and the rough air, until the horse finally turned its head away, exhausted. "You need more than I can give you out here," Ethan muttered to himself. He scanned the yard again, looking for anything he could use. There was an old tarp near the barn, stiff from sun exposure but still whole. He dragged it over, spreading it onto the ground so the horse wouldn't lie directly on the scorching dirt. With effort, he eased the animal's head onto the edge of the tarp, careful not to cause more pain. "That's better," he said, though he doubted the horse could hear him. The sun climbed higher, heat settling onto the land like a heavy blanket. Sweat gathered at Ethan's temples, sliding down the side of his face. He rose, went inside, grabbed the old shade umbrella he used to keep the porch cool, and planted it into the ground to cast a thin shadow over the horse. Only then did he step back and breathe. He had forgotten this feeling, the strange stillness that came when you acted not out of obligation, but because some quiet part of you insisted you couldn't walk away. It reminded him of the days before everything had collapsed, back when he believed in honesty, partnership, and security. Before the friend he trusted with all his finances exploited every loophole to take what wasn't his. Before Ethan had to sell his condo, cash out his last home insurance policy just to keep from drowning, and disappear from the city before shame swallowed him whole. The horse stirred slightly, pulling him back to the present. Ethan knelt again, studying the animal more carefully. Up close, he could see impressions around its neck, marks left by a rope pulled too tight, too long. The sight made something sharp twist inside his chest. "Who did this to you?" he whispered. The question hung in the dry air, unanswered. He rose to his feet, shielding his eyes from the sun, trying to clear his thoughts. He needed help. Someone who knew more than he did. Someone who could tell him whether this creature had a chance, or if all he was doing was delaying the inevitable. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket for his phone. An old model with cracks spiderwebbing the screen. He scrolled through the tiny list of contacts. There were only a few names he hadn't deleted in his attempt to cut ties with the world. But one stood out. Owen Rivers, his closest. Neighbor, though neighbor was generous considering the man lived almost 3 miles away. Owen had stopped by the day Ethan moved in, offering a firm handshake and a plate of cornbread that tasted like memories of a life Ethan no longer had. The older rancher knew horses, knew the land, knew hardship. Ethan hesitated for a long moment before pressing call. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Ward, everything all right?" Ethan swallowed. I need help." There was a pause on the other end. Not judgmental, not impatient, just quiet understanding. "What happened?" "A horse showed up at my gate," Ethan said softly. "It's bad, Owen. Real bad." Another pause, deeper this time. "You keep it calm. I'll come." The line clicked dead. Ethan lowered the phone, his pulse thudding against the inside of his wrists. He glanced at the horse again, watching its chest rise in uneven rhythm. He crouched beside it, letting his hand rest lightly on the tarp near its head. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "At least, not today." He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether he was equipped to save a life, any life. But as he sat there in the growing heat, waiting for Owen's truck to appear on the horizon, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The faintest flicker of responsibility. And beneath that, a barely perceptible spark of hope. He stayed like that, quiet beside the fallen horse, until the faint rumble of an approaching engine trembled through the ground. Owen's old pickup came rolling down the dirt road like a weary animal that had made the trip too many times. Its engine growled low, then sputtered as he parked beside Ethan's fence. Dust settled slowly around the truck, drifting across the yard like tired ghosts. Owen stepped out, his boots landing heavy on the ground, his hat pulled low to block the harsh midday sun. Ethan rose from where he'd been sitting beside the horse. He felt stiff, as if the tension of the morning had worked its way into his bones. Owen approached with the deliberate calm of a man who had spent most of his life around anxious creatures. His gaze went straight to the horse, softening in a way he didn't bother hiding. "Lord," he muttered under his breath, kneeling beside it. "She's worse off than I figured." Ethan blinked. "She?" Owen nodded. "Yeah, mare, young too." He gently lifted one of the horse's ears, checking the inside, then traced his fingers along the ridge of her neck. When he reached the marks left by the rope, his jaw tightened. "Someone did a number on her." The anger in his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It simmered just beneath the surface, the kind of anger that came from seeing too many living beings mistreated for no good reason. Ethan felt a stirring in his chest that he didn't quite recognize. Something between sorrow and guilt, though he had no part in what happened to her. He just didn't like the idea that anyone could treat a helpless creature this way. "What do we do?" he asked. Owen exhaled slowly. "Get her out of this sun, for one. Heat like this'll cook her from the inside." He glanced around the yard. "You still got that old stall in the barn?" "Yeah, I cleaned it out last month, just to keep the dust down." "Well," Owen grunted, "you're about to get some real use out of it." They worked together in silence. Ethan fetched the halter Owen had brought, though neither man expected the mare to stand yet. Owen murmured to her softly, words Ethan couldn't hear but could feel, the way one feels kindness before understanding it. They slid a folded blanket under her chest and belly, then synced their movements, lifting just enough to shift her weight. The mare grimaced, a low sound escaping her throat, but she didn't fight. "She's got spirit," Owen said gently. "Hurts like hell, but she's holding on." Step by slow, deliberate step, they coaxed her upright. Her legs trembled violently, her head drooping so low Ethan thought she might collapse again. He braced his shoulder under her neck, steadying her weight. The warmth of her breath grazed his collarbone, and something inside him changed. Not abruptly, but quietly, like a door he thought was locked, easing open. Together, he and Owen guided her toward the barn. The walk was excruciatingly slow. She took one step, then rested, then another. The world around them existed only in fragments. The crunch of gravel beneath their boots, the soft groan of the barn door as Ethan pushed it open, the faint rustle of hay inside. But beneath all those sounds was a deep, intimate silence that settled around them like evening snow. When they finally reached the stall, the mare bowed her head and eased herself down before they could lower her. She folded into the hay as if surrendering to a softer world. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing a few strands of straw from her face. "You're safe," he whispered without thinking. Owen straightened his back, groaning softly. "She needs water, shade, rest, and food. But slow, Ward. Too much too fast will hurt her." He paused. "She also needs a vet." Ethan stiffened. The word vet echoed through his mind like a distant warning bell. He had been living on savings and odd jobs, stretching every dollar across the empty days. The idea of paying for professional veterinary care felt like lifting a weight he wasn't sure his shoulders could bear. But when he looked at the mare, her fragile breaths, her exhaustion, her trust in the strangers who had lifted her, there wasn't a choice. Not one he could live with. "Call whoever you trust," Ethan said quietly. "Tell them to come." Owen nodded, pulling out his phone. While he spoke to the vet, Ethan remained kneeling beside the mare, his hand resting gently on her neck this time. Not hovering, not hesitating, so felt natural now, as if the morning's fear had slipped into the cracks of the barn floor. When Owen hung up, he said, "They'll be here in a few hours. You keep her cool, talk to her, voice helps." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think she understands?" "She understands tone," Owen said, "and intent. Animals are better judges of character than most folks I know." Ethan didn't argue. Owen left soon after, promising to return with supplies. His truck rumbled away, leaving Ethan alone in the dim, cool barn. Outside, the sun blazed mercilessly, but in here, the world felt smaller, quieter, almost gentle. Light filtered through the slats in long golden stripes that stretched across the mare's coat. Ethan leaned back against the wooden wall, watching her chest rise and fall. She wasn't asleep. Her eyes drifted open every few minutes, but she was resting, recharging whatever strength remained inside her battered body. "You came a long way," he murmured. "I don't know why. I don't know how you made it this far." He paused, listening to the faint rustle of hay beneath her breathing. "I didn't think I'd be doing any of this again, helping anything, letting anything near." The mare shifted slightly, her ear twitching toward his voice. Ethan smiled faintly. "Guess you didn't give me much of a choice." Hours passed in a slow, hushed rhythm. Ethan brought small buckets of water, letting her sip when she wanted. He dampened a cloth and laid it across her neck to keep her cool. He swept the stall, not because it needed to be spotless, but because movement kept him from thinking too hard. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky to a washed-out lavender, the mare lifted her head for the first time on her own. Ethan froze, breath caught. Her eyes found his again, clearer now, but still burdened by exhaustion. Something shifted in that dim space. The haze of the day settled into a soft, silver glow as the first hints of moonlight crept through the barn window. Ethan reached out a hand. She leaned into it, her cheek pressed against his palm. Not desperate, not fearful, simply present. A small, fragile acceptance. A moment so quiet he wasn't sure it was real until he felt her warm breath exhale against his wrist. Ethan closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not judged, not questioned, just acknowledged by a living creature that had no reason to trust him, yet chose to anyway. He let his palm rest on her cheek as the moon climbed higher, its pale light washing over them. Solace, he whispered suddenly. The name came out of nowhere, yet fit perfectly, like a story he had been waiting to remember. "That's your name," he said, voice barely audible. "If you'll let me call you that." The mare blinked slowly, her breath warm against his fingers. And Ethan understood that something had begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, steady way a heart starts beating. Again, after being still for too long. The moon had drifted high above the barn when Ethan finally drifted into a shallow sleep, his back still resting against the wooden wall and his hand loosely placed near Solace's cheek. The night air had cooled the barn, carrying the faint smell of hay and dust, an old, familiar scent he hadn't noticed in years. When dawn crept in, it came quietly, brushing pale gold across the mare's coat and nudging Ethan awake with a thin beam of light across his face. He blinked slowly, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where he was and why he was here. Solace lay curled beside him, her breathing steadier than the night before. The rise and fall of her ribs no longer felt like a fight for survival. Still fragile, but calmer, more rhythmic. Ethan shifted carefully, afraid to disturb her. The barn had a strange serenity to it, as if the night had pressed its thumb to the world and softened all its sharp edges. "Morning," he whispered. Solace lifted an ear toward his voice, then lifted her head, only slightly, but without the trembling that had marked every movement the previous day. Ethan felt something warm unfurl inside him. It wasn't triumph. It was smaller than that. Something like gratitude. He stood, stretching his stiff limbs. He hadn't slept in the barn since he was a child visiting his uncle's ranch in Texas, back when life felt safer, simpler, when the worst thing he knew was a scraped knee or a missed baseball practice. He'd grown up, chased opportunity, and eventually lost everything in ways he still couldn't fully process. Sometimes he thought the collapse had broken something permanent inside him. Other times he worried it hadn't broken enough. He filled a small bucket with fresh water and carried it back to Solace. She lifted her head a little higher when she heard him approach. When he set the bucket down, she nudged her nose toward it, sniffed, and took slow, measured sips. The sight made his throat tighten. The difference between yesterday and today was small, but small things mattered. Small things kept a heartbeat going. "There you go," he murmured. "Take your time. Nobody's rushing you." As she drank, Ethan noticed the early sunlight warming the edges of her coat, highlighting every ridge of bone beneath. She was still painfully thin, but her eyes, when she glanced up, were clearer, less clouded by exhaustion. He stepped out of the stall and walked toward the feed room. Owen had dropped off a burlap sack of nutrient-rich pellets the night before, leaving a note on the barn door. Tiny portions. Often. Keep her from gulping. Ethan grabbed a handful, placed it in a shallow pan, and brought it back to Solace. She sniffed it cautiously but didn't dive in. Instead, she looked toward him, an almost questioning glance, before lowering her head to eat. One pellet at a time. Slow, measured, thoughtful. "You're smart," Ethan breathed. "Smarter than I was, for sure." He didn't expect the emotion that welled up afterward. It hit him quietly, like a wave swelling beneath the surface. He sank back down beside her, letting his hand rest against the stall door. He had spent months trying to rebuild his life after the lawsuit, the bankruptcy, the betrayal that had scraped him raw. He had filed endless paperwork, spent hours on the phone with agencies, navigated health insurance claims and financial forms, until he felt like his life had been reduced to numbers and signatures. Healing had become a chore, a task he could never seem to finish. But this, sitting beside a creature who had survived her own unseen war, felt different. It felt possible. Solace finished eating, then shifted, as if testing her strength. Her front legs tensed, trembling under her, but she didn't rise. Not yet. Ethan placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to rush," he said again, softer this time. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, he noticed small changes, subtle but undeniable. Solace rolled her weight slightly to one side, adjusting her position to get more comfortable. She flicked her tail once, a movement that felt strangely hopeful. When Ethan stepped away to fetch more hay, she followed him with her eyes. An alertness he hadn't seen before. By noon, the vet arrived. A sharp-minded woman named Dr. Caldwell, with sun-cracked skin and a steady gaze. She entered the stall with calm professionalism, her hands moving across Solace's body with practiced gentleness. Ethan watched anxiously as she checked vital signs, examined the rope scars, and inspected her hooves. After a long silence, the vet straightened and brushed dust off her knees. "She's beaten up," Dr. Caldwell said. "Dehydrated, malnourished, exhausted. But she's got a good heart, strong pulse, and she trusts you. That's worth something." Ethan felt heat rise to his face. "I'm not sure I deserve that." "She thinks you do," the vet answered simply. Dr. Caldwell gave instructions: hydration schedule, feed portions, rest recommendations, and reassured him that Solace had a fighting chance. "Won't be easy," she added. "But she wants to live. That's half the battle." After she left, the barn settled back into its familiar quiet. Ethan stayed beside Solace as afternoon shadows slid across the straw. The hours passed in small rituals: water, feed, soft words, gentle touch. He didn't think of the future. He didn't think of the past. He thought only of the mare beside him and the fragile thread connecting them. Then, near sunset, Solace surprised him. She tucked her legs beneath her, shifted her weight, and slowly, painfully, but deliberately, pushed herself upward. Ethan froze, afraid to interfere, afraid to hope too hard. Her muscles quivered. She paused, breathing hard, and Ethan felt his own breath sink with hers. "Easy, girl," he whispered. She pushed again. And this time, her body rose. For a long heartbeat, she stood. Thin, shaky, but undeniably standing. Ethan's chest tightened, his eyes stinging in a way he didn't try to hide. Solace lifted her head, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that didn't belong to yesterday's dying creature. "You did it," Ethan said, barely audible. Solace took one small step toward him. Just one, but it felt like a mile. The moment held, suspended between them like a fragile promise, not of recovery, not of certainty, but of possibility. Outside, the last of the sunlight spilled through the barn doors, painting the dust in shimmering gold. Ethan reached out, resting his hand gently against Solace's neck. Her skin twitched under his touch, but she didn't pull away. "You're stronger than you look," he whispered. The mare exhaled softly, leaning into him in a quiet affirmation. And for the first time since he'd lost everything, Ethan felt his world begin to steady itself. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Enough to take the next step with her. Solace stood longer than Ethan expected, her legs trembling but holding, her breath steadying into something close to calm. The barn glowed with the last soft spill of sunlight, turning every speck of floating dust into a drifting ember. Ethan stayed beside her, one hand lightly pressed to her neck, afraid that any sudden movement might undo the fragile balance she'd found. When she finally eased herself back onto the straw, it was not the collapse of yesterday, but a slow, chosen descent, careful, deliberate, dignified. He let himself breathe again. Twilight settled over the ranch with a hush so gentle he almost didn't notice it. The world beyond the barn became a watercolor blur, muted purple sky, bruised horizon, and the kind of silence that felt earned, not empty. Ethan fetched another small portion of feed, and the soft crunch of Solace chewing became the evening's only soundtrack. It was astonishing how quickly the rhythms of care wrapped themselves around him. There was something grounding about it, a steadying force he had forgotten he needed. The barn had not felt lived in for months. Dust had taken up residence where life once had a place. But now, with Solace shifting softly in her stall, the space seemed to breathe again. Ethan swept the floor even though it didn't require sweeping, straightened the tools on their hooks, adjusted the lantern without reason. The movements weren't chores. They were a way of settling the restlessness inside him. He stepped outside to let the cooler evening air settle over him. The horizon flickered with distant lightning. Heat lightning, harmless but beautiful. Crickets offered their faint chorus. The ranch, usually indifferent, felt like it was watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. Ethan returned to the barn and found Solace watching him with one calm, half-lidded eye. "You're doing better," he whispered. "Better than I thought. Possible." She blinked slowly, as if acknowledging him. He eased himself down onto the hay just outside her stall door. His back found the familiar curve of the wooden beam. As he settled, Solace extended her muzzle slightly toward him, her breath warm and damp on his sleeve. The small gesture carried a depth he couldn't articulate. Gratitude? Curiosity? Or simply the acknowledgement of a presence that had become safe overnight? Ethan touched her cheek, making sure to keep his movement slow. She leaned into his palm, nudging him lightly. The barn's lantern cast a soft glow across her features, revealing a quiet strength beneath the exhaustion. "You know," Ethan murmured, "I used to think life was just something that happened to me, that it blew up, and I had to spend whatever time I had left trying to sweep up the ashes." He exhaled through his nose. "Turns out I might have been sweeping the wrong things." Solace flicked her ear. "It wasn't small," he continued, "what happened back then. Losing the firm, losing trust, finding out someone you called a friend had been draining your accounts through online banking fraud for months. The words tasted bitter, but speaking them aloud, here, in the quiet, to a creature that had no expectations of him, made them feel less poisonous. "I didn't come here to heal," he said softly. "I came here to disappear." Solace nudged his elbow, a tiny, insistent gesture that startled a faint, disbelieving laugh out of him. "Yeah, I guess you're right. That didn't work out so well." Footsteps sounded outside, slow, deliberate. Ethan rose quickly, brushing hay from his jeans. Solace lifted her head, ears pricked toward the doorway. A figure approached from the shadows, a woman in uniform, her flashlight held low. "Ethan Ward?" she asked. He nodded. "That's me." She stepped inside, her boots crunching over loose straw. "I'm Jenna Harper, County Animal Welfare. Owen Rivers called me. Said you had a situation." Ethan's stomach tightened. "She's in here." Jenna approached the stall, her expression shifting as she took in Solace's thin frame and the deep rope marks still faintly visible around her neck. She crouched, shining her light gently along the mare's side without touching her. "She's in rough shape," Jenna murmured. "But alert, that's a good sign." Ethan stood awkwardly beside her. "We've been trying to stabilize her." "You're doing more than most people would," Jenna said, glancing up at him. "Do you know where she came from?" "No," he answered truthfully. "She just showed up at my gate yesterday." Jenna studied him for a long moment, not suspicious, but evaluating. Something in his tired eyes must have told her what she needed to know. She nodded and rose. "These marks," she said, tapping her flashlight lightly near the mare's neck, "aren't from a regular halter. This is restraint. Tight, prolonged, probably deliberate." Ethan felt a pulse of anger rise beneath his ribs. "Someone hurt her." Jenna didn't soften her words. "Yes, and I intend to find out who." Solace shifted, watching the woman with wary but quiet eyes. Jenna lowered her flashlight and stepped back to give the mare space. "You're safe now, sweetheart," she whispered, then turned to Ethan. "I'll open a report. Might need to ask you a few more questions later. For now, just keep doing what you're doing." She took a step toward the door, then paused. "Ward?" "Yeah?" "You did the right thing." Her voice carried no praise, only recognition. "Not everyone would have opened that gate." Ethan swallowed the tightness in his throat. It didn't feel like a choice. "Most good things don't," Jenna replied, before walking out into the dusky yard. The barn fell quiet again, though a different kind of quiet now. A quiet stretched thin by questions, by the faint edges of fear, by the mystery of what Solace had escaped. Ethan returned to the stall and knelt beside her once more. She lowered her head until her cheek rested near his knee. "You're safe now," he whispered again, repeating Jenna's words but molding them into something personal. "Whoever did this to you, they're not getting you back." Solace sighed, her breath warm against his leg. Night settled fully around them. Somewhere outside, an owl called low. Ethan stayed beside her until her breathing deepened, then deeper still, slipping into the restful sleep of a creature no longer fighting for survival. He lowered his hand gently to her cheek. For the first time in years, he felt himself anchored. Not to fear, not to loss, but to something steadier, something alive, something choosing him back. The night after Jenna's visit was the first time Ethan slept in his own bed in days, though the sleep was fractured and too light to feel like rest. Every few hours he woke, half expecting to hear Solace struggling, half afraid the barn would somehow feel empty again. When dawn finally came, he rose before the sunlight fully reached the windows, pulling on his boots with an urgency he didn't fully understand. The air outside was oddly warm for early morning, a dense heat that clung to the skin. Something in the wind felt wrong. Not dangerous yet, just unsettled. Ethan crossed the yard quickly, the brittle grass crunching beneath his feet. When he pushed open the barn doors, he found Solace standing. Not shaky the way she'd been before, not collapsing into herself, but standing with her head lifted and her ears pricked forward, alert, sensing something he couldn't. The sight rooted him in place. She looked almost like a different horse, still thin, still healing, but undeniably present. "Well," Ethan murmured, "look at you." Solace turned toward his voice, and something like recognition flickered in her eyes. She took one small step in his direction, then another. Ethan smiled despite himself, the feeling rising quietly through his chest like a tide coming in. He reached out and ran a hand along her muzzle. Her skin twitched slightly under his touch, but she didn't withdraw. "You're getting stronger," he whispered. "That's trouble for both of us." He filled her water bucket and laid out the morning's portion of feed. Still careful, still small. Solace ate with more enthusiasm than before, though she stopped often to glance toward the barn door, ears flicking nervously at sounds Ethan couldn't hear. "What's gotten into you?" he asked softly. A gust of wind pushed through the open windows, carrying with it the thick scent of dust. The rafters creaked. Outside, a loose sheet of metal slapped against the side of the shed. Solace jerked her head up, her whole body tightening like a coiled spring. Ethan frowned. "Easy, girl. It's just the wind." But even as he said it, he felt something uneasy stirring in his gut. He stepped outside and scanned the horizon. The sky above the desert was usually an open bowl, vast, clear, uninterrupted. Today, heavy shapes pressed against it. Darker clouds hovered in the distance, low and bloated, smeared with a faint reddish tint from the dust rising beneath them. He hadn't seen that kind of sky since he was a kid, a sky that didn't just promise weather, but threatened it. A bow buoy, a dust storm. He'd learned to read them once. He thought he'd forgotten how. He hadn't. Solace suddenly let out a sharp breath behind him, half snort, half warning. Ethan turned back to her. She wasn't simply nervous. She was frightened. The kind of fear that came from memory, not imagination. "It's not here yet," Ethan said, stepping back into the barn. "We've got time." He began securing the loose boards, tying down the tarp, making sure the latches were tight. The barn had survived storms before, but not recently, and not with a fragile horse inside. Solace paced the stall, her movements quick and uncertain. Every sound outside made her flinch. Ethan paused to rest his hand on her neck. "You're okay. I'm right here." But his voice couldn't reach the storm inside her. He wasn't sure he understood why she reacted so strongly, until his mind flashed back to the rope marks on her neck, the exhaustion in her body when she first arrived, the way Jenna had said those cuts came from restraint, not accident. What had she endured out there? What storms had she survived alone? He swallowed the question. By noon, the wind had picked up enough to throw sand across the yard in thin streaks. Ethan worked faster, closing shutters, dragging the old trough against the barn door to reinforce it. Sweat collected at his back and dripped down his spine. Each gust of wind carried more grit, biting into his skin. Solace's agitation grew with it. She stamped her hooves, then paused to stare at the door, muscles bunching under her ribs. "Don't even think about it," Ethan warned. But she wasn't thinking about the door itself. She was thinking about what lived beyond it. He stayed close to her, talking softly, about the weather, about the barn, about how he once tried signing up for identity theft protection, but figured it was pointless after he'd already lost everything. Silly things, mundane things, anything to sow a thread of calm through the air. Surprisingly, the talking helped him more than her. When Owen arrived in the late afternoon, his truck fought its way up the dirt road like it was pushing through syrup. He stepped out, hat pulled low against the sharpening wind. "You feel it?" Owen asked. "Yeah," Ethan said. "She feels it too." Owen looked past him into the barn. Solace stood rigid at the back of the stall, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. "She's been through storms," Owen said quietly. "Real ones." Ethan nodded. "We'll help her through this one," Owen added. For the next hour, they readied the barn with the practiced focus of men who understood preparation wasn't optional, but necessary. They reinforced weak points, secured ropes, and made sure nothing inside could rattle too violently. When everything that could be done was done, Owen clapped Ethan's shoulder. "Stay with her. She'll panic when it hits." "You're not staying?" "I've got to get back before the road disappears," Owen said. "But call me if it gets bad." He left quickly, and Ethan watched the truck fade into the dusty horizon until the wind began to swallow it whole. By sunset, the world had changed. The sky glowed a deep orange smeared with brown. Dust rose in continuous sheets, brushing over the ground like a restless tide. The barn shuddered under the pressure. Every board groaned. Every hinge complained. Inside, Solace could no longer stand still. She paced, circled, tossed her head, then pressed her body against the far wall, as if trying to escape the sound of the coming fury. Ethan stepped into the stall, ignoring the sting of dust on his face. "Hey," he whispered, touching her neck. "Look at me." She did. And for a moment he saw her fear plain and raw. "You survived worse than this," he said. "And you're not alone anymore." The first heavy wave of wind slammed into the barn. Solace reared slightly, not enough to strike, but enough to show the terror clawing through her. Ethan grabbed her halter, steadying her, anchoring himself against the ground. The storm hadn't even arrived yet. This was only its voice announcing itself. And Ethan understood when it fully came, it wouldn't simply test the barn. It would test everything Solace had left, and everything he was afraid he didn't. He pressed his forehead to her cheek, whispering, "I won't let anything take you." The barn trembled again, and the wind, rising with a hollow roar, answered back. The first hard gust hit the barn, with a violence that rattled the rafters, sending a thin cloud of dust spiraling through the air. Solace jolted backward, her hooves scraping the floor as if the ground itself were shifting beneath her. Ethan steadied himself against her halter, the force of the wind vibrating through the boards around them. "Easy," he whispered, though his own heartbeat was climbing. "I'm right here." But the storm didn't listen, and neither did the fear clawing its way through Solace's body. Another blast slammed against the barn wall, louder this time, like a giant's fist pounding to be let in. Solace's whole body tensed. Ethan reached for her, but she reared slightly, driven more by instinct than thought. The lantern swung wildly on its hook, casting frantic shadows across the beams. Outside, the storm's roar deepened into something primal, wind carrying sand and gravel in long, angry sheets. The sky darkened to a bruised reddish gray. It felt as if the whole desert had decided to rise and consume itself. Solace moved again, pacing the stall in a frantic half-circle. Ethan followed, keeping to her shoulder, talking softly, even as his voice shook. "You're safe. I've got you. It's just noise, girl." But he knew it wasn't just noise. This was a storm that didn't merely arrive, it invaded. A sudden sharp crack erupted from outside, like a tree snapping in half. Solace bolted forward on pure terror. Ethan tried to grab the halter but caught only air as she lunged against the stall door. The latch, weakened from years of disuse despite his repairs, gave way with a violent jolt. "Solace!" The mare pushed through the half-broken door, stumbling into the main aisle of the barn. She slipped slightly on the loose straw, regained her footing, and then, driven by a force older than memory, ran straight toward the barn entrance. Ethan sprinted after her. The barn doors were shaking wildly, their hinges screaming under the strain. Solace reached them just as a powerful gust forced one door inward. The sudden motion startled her. She sidestepped, struck the edge of a feed bin, and then, before Ethan could catch up, she darted out into the open. The storm swallowed her instantly. A wall of dust, thick and red, engulfed her silhouette until she became nothing more than a moving blur, and then nothing at all. "Solace!" Ethan shouted, but the wind ripped his voice away the moment it left his mouth. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a scarf from a peg near the entrance, wrapped it roughly around his nose and mouth, and plunged into the storm. The world outside had dissolved into chaos. Dust and gravel pelted him in relentless waves, stinging any exposed skin. The air was so thick he could barely see his own hands. The desert ground trembled beneath his boots, as if alive with the storm's rage. He staggered forward, using his arms to shield his eyes. He called Solace's name again and again. Each shout smaller than the one before, each one swallowed whole by the storm. The wind forced him sideways. He planted his boots and pushed back, though each step felt like walking through deep water. He could barely make out the outline of the fence posts, now little more than shadows swaying in and out of existence. "Solace!" He coughed hard, dust scratching down his throat. When he'd run a company, when his life had collapsed, when he'd lost everything, he'd thought he understood the meaning of being powerless. But this was something else. Being swallowed by a storm felt like grieving in real time, like watching something precious be ripped away by a force he couldn't argue with. He stumbled over a half-buried rock and hit his knees, grit grinding painfully into his palms. He forced himself upright, blinking against the sand. The wind howled with a voice that felt ancient, a voice that warned him that searching would be dangerous, reckless, that storms like this didn't distinguish between the desperate and the foolish. But Solace was out here, alone, terrified, running on instincts shaped by whatever horrors she'd escaped before. He pushed forward again. Thunder rolled low across the ground, distant but unmistakable. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the curtain of dust, illuminating the storm in violent, momentary snapshots. In one flash, Ethan thought he saw movement to his right, a faint shape stumbling against the wind. He turned sharply. "Solace!" He half ran, half fell toward the shifting form. His boots slid across the powdered earth. His scarf whipped loose, barely hanging on. The wind tasted like heat and sand and desperation. The shape vanished, then appeared again, closer this time. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't strong. It was a creature fighting to stay upright, fighting to exist. "Solace, I'm coming," he choked out. And then he saw her, truly saw her. For one heart-lurching moment, when the lightning cracked directly overhead. She was tangled in a low wire fence, the kind that divided old cattle properties. Her front leg was caught, the metal biting into her skin. She was kicking, panicked, making the fence rattle violently. Every time she struggled, the wire pulled tighter. "Hey, hey girl, stop!" Ethan yelled, though his voice broke from sand and fear. "I'm here! I'm right here!" He reached her side, grabbing the fence post with both hands to steady himself. The wind pushed him sideways. He gripped harder. Solace reared slightly, the wire digging deeper. "Easy! You'll hurt yourself. Easy!" She didn't hear him. The storm was too loud. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He just moved. He lunged forward and wrapped his arms around her neck, not to restrain her, but to anchor her, to remind her she wasn't alone, to let her feel another heartbeat in the chaos. Her muscles trembled under his hands. She fought for another few seconds, then slowed. Just enough for him to guide, her back toward the ground. "It's me," he whispered into her mane. "It's me. I've got you. I've got you." He felt her body sag, not with collapse, but with recognition. She remembered him. Even here. Even now. Bracing himself against the wind, he reached down toward the wire. His fingers fumbled, scraped, tore, but he kept going. He twisted the rusty metal, forcing it apart until it loosened around her leg. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay. Move back. Just a bit. Yeah, there." Solace pulled free with a sharp exhale. Another blast of wind hit them, so strong it nearly knocked Ethan over. Solace pressed her body into his, shielding him as much as he was shielding her. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a stray thought flickered. Maybe every broken thing finds something to hold on to, but he didn't linger on it. He tightened his grip and looked toward the vague direction of home. "Let's get out of this," he whispered. "Together." The storm howled back, daring them to try. For a long moment after Ethan freed Solace from the wire, both of them stayed pressed against each other, bracing their bodies against the storm's fury. The wind screamed around them, carrying sand sharp enough to sting through fabric, but Ethan didn't move. He let his weight rest against the mare's shoulder, grounding her, or maybe grounding himself. It was impossible to tell where one instinct ended and another began. Solace shook her head, trying to clear the dust from her eyes. Her entire frame trembled, not from weakness this time, but from fear and exhaustion woven together in raw threads. Ethan kept one arm looped gently around her neck, murmuring to her even though the storm stole every word before it reached her ears. "We're okay. We're okay. We're together." The words dissolved into the wind, but somehow she felt them. He could tell from the way her breathing shifted, from frantic, rapid bursts to something slower, heavier, more controlled. Her ribs rose and fell against his arm like a tide fighting its own undertow. He took a step, guiding her forward. She followed, but each movement was a battle. The sand whipped so violently it blurred the ground at their feet. Ethan's eyes burned, forcing him to squint through the storm. He hunched his shoulders, shielding Solace's face with his own body as best he could. The storm fought back. Another massive gust slammed into them, nearly knocking them sideways. Solace stumbled. Ethan grabbed her mane instinctively and felt her muscles bunch beneath his hand as she struggled to stay upright. They leaned into each other, trusting weight for weight, breath for breath. "Come on," Ethan rasped. "Lean with me. Lean, don't fight it." He didn't know whether he was talking to her or himself. He forced his legs to keep moving, steady, small steps, each one planted firmly in the shifting earth. For a moment, the storm thinned just enough for him to see a vague outline in the distance, the silhouette of a dead mesquite tree twisted against the sky. It stood halfway between them and the ranch, a landmark he hadn't thought of in years. "There," Ethan said. "We'll rest there." The wind swallowed the words, but Solace seemed to understand the direction he turned her toward. The two of them moved with the awkward determination of survivors who had nothing left but instinct. Sand scraped across their skin like 100 tiny blades. Ethan's throat burned. His scarf was soaked with dust. By the time they reached the tree, Solace's legs shook violently from exertion. Ethan pressed his back against the trunk, pulling her close so the twisted branches could break at least part of the wind. It wasn't much shelter, but it was something. She sagged against him, her head lowering until her muzzle brushed his shoulder. Ethan wrapped one arm around her neck again and let his forehead rest against hers. Her breath was hot and ragged. Each inhale felt like a plea, each exhale like a surrender. "You held on," he whispered. "You hear me? You held on." Her ear twitched once in response. The storm raged around them, wind, sand, and the low animal roar of the desert tearing itself open. But within the meager shelter of the dead tree, a strange stillness settled between them, as if the world had shrunk to the space their two bodies occupied, as if survival itself had become a shared heartbeat. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, remembering a day he had spent in a courtroom not long ago, papers in one hand, hope in the other, both shredded by the end of the hearing. He'd walked out feeling as small and fragile as Solace had looked the first day she appeared at his gate. That had been the moment he'd first felt the collapse of everything he'd built, the moment he'd realized he couldn't trust anyone, not colleagues, not friends. He had even withdrawn from the idea of emergency life insurance back then, convinced it was pointless to plan for a future he didn't believe he'd reach. But here, with a half-wild mare leaning into him for strength, he felt something shift inside his chest. Not a full healing, not even close, but a tiny anchoring. A reminder that life had not stopped asking him to show up. Another blast of wind shook the mesquite tree. Ethan tightened his hold on Solace. "Not much farther," he said into her mane. "When this slows, we go. We don't stop until we're home." As if responding to his promise, the storm changed its rhythm. The shrieking wind softened just enough to bring the world into a hazy outline again. Ethan could see the ghost shape of his barn in the distance, distorted but unmistakable. He straightened slowly, coaxing Solace upright with him. Her legs quivered, threatening to give way, but she lifted her head and stared toward the faint silhouette of home. Her ears flicked forward, not in fear this time, but in recognition. She remembered that place. She remembered safety. "Good girl," Ethan murmured. "Let's finish it." They stepped away from the tree and entered the storm again, but now they moved with purpose. Solace walked closer to him, her body pressed against his side, trusting him to guide her through the screaming wind. Every few steps, Ethan lifted a hand to shield her eyes from the sand. They staggered, slipped, caught themselves, and kept moving. Halfway to the barn, a violent gust collapsed into them, nearly knocking them both to their knees. Solace's front leg buckled, and Ethan fell with her, catching himself in the dirt. The sand tore across his back like fire. He crawled toward her, shouting words the storm immediately swallowed. She was shaking again. He pressed both hands against her neck. "Get up," he whispered hoarsely. "You can. I know you can. Solace groaned, a deep, painful sound. Ethan moved around her, placing his shoulder under hers the way Owen had taught him days earlier. He braced his legs, pushed upward, and felt her rise with him. Slow, trembling, but rising. That's it. That's my girl. Don't quit now. Together, they found their footing again. When they finally reached the barn doors, Ethan slammed his body against one of them and shoved it open. The wind fought him, trying to pin it back in place, but he forced it wide enough for Solace to stumble inside. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the storm's roar became muted, replaced by the familiar creaks of the barn sheltering them again. Ethan closed the door with all the strength he had left. When the latch clicked into place, he sagged against it, dust cascading off his clothes like rain. Solace stood in the center of the barn aisle, chest rising and falling in deep, shuddering breaths. She looked toward him, dirty, exhausted, trembling, but alive. He walked toward her slowly, afraid any sudden movement might break the fragile victory hanging between them. When he reached her side, she lowered her head until her forehead rested against his sternum. He wrapped both arms around her neck and held her. They stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the storm continued roaring across the desert. Inside, two survivors stood not because they were strong, but because, for the first time, they refused to fall alone. For a long time after they collapsed together in the barn's dim shelter, Ethan didn't move. His arms remained wrapped around Solace's neck, and her breath, still shaky but undeniably alive, warmed the front of his shirt. The storm outside continued to rage with a violence that felt almost personal, slamming into the barn walls as if trying to claim what it had failed to take. But inside, there was a fragile, trembling peace. Solace gradually eased her weight off him and sank into the straw, her chest heaving from exhaustion. Ethan lowered himself beside her, resting his back against a post while catching his own breath. His shirt clung to him with a mix of sweat and dust. His throat burned. His arms felt scraped raw. But he didn't care. They were inside. They were alive. And for now, that was enough. He reached out and brushed dust from her muzzle, the gesture gentle and slow. Solace blinked once, the movement languid and soft, and nudged his fingertips as if to say she understood. Not the words, just the intent. The heartbeat beneath them both. The presence. The survival. The storm rumbled again, but something in its voice had changed. It wasn't the wild, ripping howl of earlier. It had shifted. Lower now, tired, like a creature burning off the last of its fury. Ethan listened carefully, almost afraid to hope, but he'd been through enough storms, literal and otherwise, to recognize a turning point when it arrived. "Almost done," he murmured to Solace. She closed her eyes, allowing the world to settle into her bones. As minutes became hours, the wind weakened. The sand's hiss became a whisper. Then, after one final distant roll of thunder, the desert fell into a deep quiet, an exhausted hush, as if the entire landscape had been holding its breath and was now finally allowed to exhale. Ethan stood slowly, his muscles protesting. He walked toward the barn doors and pressed his palm against the wood. No more shaking. The world outside felt still. Carefully, he unlatched the door and pushed it open just enough to look out. For a moment, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The desert, usually a hard, cracked expanse of rust-colored earth, gleamed under a low, shifting light. The sky, moments ago, a nightmare of twisting dust, had opened into an endless canvas of muted gold and violet. Clouds drifted like soft bruises across the horizon. And falling from those clouds, quiet and deliberate, were the first drops of rain. Real rain. Ethan stepped outside, letting one cool droplet strike his cheek, then another, and another. The thirsty ground drank each one instantly, darkening in small circles that spread like the start of a miracle. The scent of wet earth, sharp, metallic, impossibly clean, bloomed around him. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the air shift from dust-choked to fresh as the rain thickened. Behind him, Solace stirred. Ethan turned back and found her standing, unsteady but upright, framed by the barn's doorway. Her coat, still dull from exhaustion, now shimmered faintly beneath the rain-soaked evening light. She stepped forward, her hooves sinking slightly into the dampening soil. "You made it," Ethan whispered, as if reminding himself as much as her. He walked toward her, and together they stood under the softening rain. Solace lifted her chin toward the sky, letting the droplets fall across her face and neck. She closed her eyes, her body trembling. Not from fear now, but from release. From relief. Ethan raised his hand and rested it against her cheek. The rain slid across his knuckles, cool and steady. The storm had taken almost everything from them. Strength, breath, clarity, safety. But it had also revealed something he hadn't expected. What it meant to belong to another living being in survival. He leaned his forehead against Solace's, a gesture so simple, yet so weighted, that it sent a quiet ache through him. Their breaths aligned in the darkening air, the heat of her presence grounding him, anchoring him to something real, something alive, something chosen. The rain grew stronger, falling in soft sheets that blurred the barn and the yard. Ethan's clothes became damp, then soaked, but he didn't step back. Solace stayed pressed against him, letting the water wash the dust from her coat, the storm's fear from her bones. "This is the first rain in months," Ethan whispered. "You brought it, didn't you?" Of course she didn't answer. She didn't need to. He lifted his head to look at her, really look at her, and saw something new. A quiet resilience, a kind of knowing, as if she had walked through storms before, and though she might not have emerged unscarred, she had emerged. And she had chosen, for reasons he didn't yet understand, to make him part of her survival. Lightning flickered far off, gentle and harmless now. The remaining clouds drifted apart, revealing a faint slice of dusk blue sky. Ethan let the moment settle into him, realizing he hadn't felt this calm, not this grounded, in years. All the spreadsheets, the lawsuits, the debts, the fractured trust, the endless worry about rebuilding, the fear of who he was without his former life. All of it felt smaller in this rain-softened reality. Inside the barn, a drip echoed softly from a metal pail. Outside, the puddles widened into shallow mirrors. Ethan turned to look at the old wind vane atop the roof. The thing had never worked properly. He hadn't touched it since moving in, but now it spun lazily in the gentle wind. He made a mental note that maybe he should finally install a proper weather monitoring system. A normal man would have done that months ago. Solace stepped closer, bumping her head softly against his shoulder. "Yeah," he said, voice thickening. "We'll start fixing things, one at a time." The mare huffed, an exhale that warmed the chilled air between them. He guided her back into the barn, not to shut out the rain, but to let her rest. She settled onto the straw again, curling her legs beneath her with a deep, satisfied breath. Ethan lingered beside her, watching the slow rise and fall of her ribs, the soft rhythm of a creature no longer fighting to exist. As the rain drummed a gentle cadence on the barn roof, he felt his own breathing match hers again. Steady, slow, unforced. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he wasn't bracing for loss. He wasn't hiding from the world. He wasn't trying to disappear. He was simply here, alive, needed, and, for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, chosen. The rain continued falling, outside, cleansing the desert one quiet drop at a time. The rain lasted through most of the night, soft at first, then steady enough to drum a rhythm on the barn roof that soothed every raw edge in Ethan's body. By dawn, the storm had fully passed, leaving behind the kind of silence that only follows great violence. A silence that didn't feel empty, but earned. The desert outside glistened with scattered puddles, each one catching the reflection of a sky washed clean. Ethan woke with a start, still sitting beside Solace. At some point he had dozed off, his head leaning against the stall door. The mare lay stretched comfortably on her side, breathing slow and deep. She looked peaceful, truly peaceful, her exhaustion replaced with something gentler, something like trust. He stood slowly, stretching his stiff muscles. A soft groan escaped him. He hadn't realized how much the storm had taken out of him until the quiet magnified every ache. Solace lifted her head as he approached, blinking away the last remnants of sleep. She nudged his shirt lightly, as if reminding him she was hungry. "All right," he said, voice still sandpapered by the night. "Breakfast it is." He filled a small pan with pellets and added a handful of fresh hay. Solace ate without rushing, her ears flicking lazily with each quiet sound the morning made. Through the barn doors, sunlight filtered in, not harsh and unforgiving as before, but warm, diffused, gentle. For the first time since he'd moved here, Ethan didn't dread the day ahead. He stepped outside to inspect the damage. The yard was littered with broken branches and loose boards. The fence was bowed in places, barely holding. One of the old gutters hung at an angle, dripping the last of the rainwater. He breathed out slowly. The ranch needed work, much more than he could handle alone. But instead of dread, he felt something else stir. Something he hadn't felt toward this place since buying it. Commitment. Maybe even hope. He ran a hand through his hair, still gritty from the storm. "Guess we're calling in some help for this mess," he muttered. For the first time, hiring proper home improvement services didn't feel like giving up. It felt like taking responsibility. For himself. For Solace. For the ranch that had been waiting for him to show up. He turned when he heard soft hoofsteps behind him. Solace had wandered out of the barn, moving slowly but confidently, her coat glistening in the new morning light. She stopped beside him, looking out at the rain-soaked land as if studying a world she'd never fully seen before. Ethan touched her neck gently. "We made it," he whispered. Her breath fluttered against his sleeve. Moments later, a truck rumbled up the dirt road, tires splashing through new-formed puddles. The sight of it sent a faint unease lacing up Ethan's spine until he recognized the vehicle. Owen stepped out, followed by Jenna. Both looked as though they'd been checking on half the county since dawn. "You're alive," Owen said. though his voice carried the smallest thread of relief. "Barely," Ethan replied. "But alive." Jenna approached Solace first, her steps slow, respectful. The mare didn't flinch this time, just watched her with soft, steady eyes. Jenna smiled gently. "She looks different." "She feels different," Ethan said. Jenna nodded, then gestured toward the broken fence in the distance. "We're tracking reports. Some neighbors saw unfamiliar horse trailers moving before the storm hit. Could be tied to our investigation. When I know more, I'll tell you." Ethan sensed the weight behind her words. Solace's past hadn't vanished with the storm. But he also knew that whatever had hurt her wouldn't define her future. Not here, not with him. Owen clapped a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Storms test what's worth keeping," he said. "Looks like she's worth more than most." Ethan didn't trust his voice enough to respond. After they left, the ranch felt strangely larger, like the land had been stretched and softened by the rain. Solace wandered the yard, sniffing the damp earth, taking careful steps as though appreciating the gentleness beneath her hooves. Ethan followed her, letting her choose the pace. She stopped near the old gate, the same gate she had collapsed beside not so long ago. He walked up beside her, resting his palm on the weathered wood. "This is where it started," he said quietly. Solace lowered her head, touching her muzzle to the gate as if acknowledging the memory. Ethan looked out toward the road, the same road she had come down, starving and shaking, a shadow of the creature she was now. The same road he had stood on for months, hiding from the world, afraid to open anything. Doors, opportunities, himself. Without thinking, he reached for the gate latch. It clicked open with a familiar metallic sigh. But this time, he wasn't opening it for something to come in. He was opening it so he could step out. He led Solace forward, walking with her beyond the gate, down the road made new by the rain. The morning sun warmed their backs. The puddles reflected the sky like pieces of a broken mirror, finally learning how to hold light again. Ethan walked with his hand resting gently on her neck, their shadows merging on the wet dirt. "I don't know what comes next," he said softly, "but I'm not running from it anymore." Solace turned her head toward him, brushing his shoulder with her cheek. The touch was simple, quiet, enough to anchor him, enough to remind him that broken things didn't always stay broken. Sometimes they found each other. Sometimes they healed in the same breath. They walked farther down the road, letting the world open around them. The desert shimmered with the first signs of green, the earliest hints of life answering the rain. A new season beginning, where the old one had tried so hard to bury everything. Ethan inhaled deeply, the air smelling of wet soil and second chances. He looked at Solace, and for the first time in years, his smile didn't feel borrowed or forced. It felt like his. They continued down the road, quiet, steady, side by side, not needing direction, not needing certainty. Just movement. Just trust. Just the promise that whatever waited beyond the next bend, they would meet it together. The storm was behind them. The rain was fading. The future, for the first time, felt possible. And they walked into it. One step, one breath, one quiet morning at a time. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a simple comment, just a word, a feeling, anything that stayed with you. And if you want more quiet, meaningful stories like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support helps these journeys continue.